I have the honor of inviting up here someone who I met through this Loeb Fellowship community, Harriet Tregoning. She comes from Washington, D.C. We had to lure out people from all over the country to this conference because we wanted the best and brightest in the ADU world. And Harriet led the Office of Community Planning and Development at the U.S. Department of HUD in the Obama administration. Her work at HUD encompassed helping states, regions, and localities build a strong foundation for resilience and for a diverse and prosperous economy based on enhancing community quality of place, economic opportunity, fiscal stability, transportation choice, and housing affordability. Tregoning was previously the director of the DC Office of Planning, so she had first-time on-the-ground experience with a zone change here, where she led the first comprehensive zoning revision in more than 50 years. Major changes included allowing ADUs by right in most residential zones. She's now working with a coalition of organizations in DC to help implement the new accessory dwelling unit provisions. I come from Washington, DC, that's where I grew up. DC took a little pause in building ADUs for about 100 years, and they're about to do it again now in force. Harriet's also a Loeb Fellow, which means she's a troublemaker, and I look forward to hearing her perspective both from the DC level and from the national. So please welcome Harriet Tregoning.
Thank you, Eli. I'm really excited to be here. I'm excited by so many people in the audience and so many people coming from around the country. And I really want to thank the organizers of this conference to kind of recognizing the power of our potential collective action. This is a really different way to meet our housing challenges in so many communities. As Eli says, it's an old way, but it's a way that, that we definitely need to revisit. Eli mentioned that when I was the planning director in DC, we did our first comprehensive rewrite of our zoning regulations in, in more than 50 years. And that comprehensive zoning reform was key to a lot of different changes. And I have to say, I know we have a lot of people who are coming from around the country. How many of you already have, if you're from somewhere else, have already have zoning in place that allows ADUs? All right. How many of you are looking to allow ADUs in your jurisdiction? So, okay, so that's not a small number of people. This was a comprehensive look at zoning, and I have to say, when I think about how controversial ADUs might have been, it was dwarfed by other concerns in the zoning code revisions, especially revisions surrounding parking, getting rid of parking minimums in much of the city. And I have to say that was probably a blessing in disguise, because what made it a lot easier to get other parts of the code through, because they just didn't get very much attention, and ADUs were one of those things. We had a very creaky code that was really hard to use. I mean, we called it the Land Use Lawyer Full Employment Act, because you couldn't do anything practically. It was so complicated. Every property had several different layers of zoning that had attached to it over the years. It was really difficult to figure out. So there was a lot of support for a comprehensive reform, but what we ended up doing was considerable. The Planning Foundation was laid really by our comprehensive plan, which was passed the month before I became planning director. So I basically said I wasn't coming if the council didn't pass it, because it would have been the first 4 years of my work would have been trying to get it passed if it didn't go through. But fortunately, it did, and it's a great comprehensive plan in so many ways, and sets out a lot of values and goals for the future. Including how we manage growth and change, how we grow inclusively, what's a successful neighborhood, what connects us and to each other and to opportunities in the city, how to increase access. And one of the big things in the comprehensive plan was the need to reform the zoning code. So I had great standing coming into a planning job with that as the as the background. And it's definitely true that the future that we had envisioned when the code was first adopted in 1958 was not the future we were in. That everyone would have one or more automobiles, that parking was the most important thing to provide in order for the city to be functional, that we would separate uses, that we would prioritize. In 1958, people were really beginning to leave the city in droves. So we did a lot in transportation to make it possible for those commuters to whiz in and out of our city as fast as possible, residents be damned. And it was, it really made our city not, the walkable, transit-friendly place that it now is. And let's think about what this means in terms of household sizes. Robert's presentation was great, talking about the fact that 1- and 2-person households have grown tremendously, almost doubled since 1950. What's also true in the district is that household sizes were half again as large, on average in 1950 as they are today, and that while our population in 2010 was almost 200,000 people fewer, we had 40,000 more dwelling units, right? So we'd spread out a smaller population into more housing, and so that was that was a big difference. And I know that all of you think about this a lot, think about the future, but a lot of people live in neighborhoods where they are, an enormous amount has changed and they're not even aware of it, right? They do the same thing that they did 20 and 30 years ago, and they're not aware of so much of the demographic changes, the transportation options, all kinds of other things. And I think one of the most important jobs for planners is to manage change in communities with those communities, and that starts by talking to them about what was the past, what's the present, what looks like it's coming, and how do we prepare for it in a way that gives people the most choices and that helps them preserve what they love about their neighborhood, but also fix the things that aren't working so well. And in so many of our neighborhoods, what's not working so well is housing cost. We've already heard about it. We'll hear more about it today. Options if you want to age in place, et cetera, et cetera. So. The building stock in DC has been a very bad fit for this new demographic. Robert said that 62% of households nationally are 1- and 2-person. In cities, that number is actually much larger. It's as large as 80% of households. It's 44% of households in the District of Columbia are single-person households. So you can see how this larger housing stock is not a great fit. 55% of all the zoned land in the District of Columbia, much higher number than Portland, is zoned for single-family detached housing. Right? We have a lot of other housing types that Portland may not have, that's smaller and denser and that provides a lot of our housing, a lot of our dwelling units. But in terms of the sheer land mass, we've zoned a ton of it for single-family detached, and that's a not very easily changeable building form unless we use something like ADUs. So I mentioned households. Let's also talk about population trends. So part of the job is to figure out, well, do we need more housing? DC was a place that for 5 straight decades dropped in population, right? I mean, as much as we plan for growth every single year, no. Declining population. So the year that I became planning director was the year that the population really began to turn around. And we've been growing at between 900 and 1,200 people a month, every month since then. So the July, the population trend is important, but also to look at what else is happening. We're getting more and more people over the age of 60. Washington is a great naturally occurring retirement community. Lots of free museums, pretty inexpensive transit, very walkable. That's absolutely true. But it's also true that that growth in that single person household growth and two-person is substantial. I will say that we did adopt another policy innovation that has actually increased the rate of family formation in the district and increased the birth rate in the district. Would you think there's a policy a planner could implement that would increase the birth rate? What would that be? We did liberalize our marijuana laws. So I'll tell you what it was. We didn't put anything in the water. We provided universal pre-kindergarten for 3- and 4-year-olds, not means tested. So it's worth between $20,000 and $30,000 a year per household per child. We're thinking about taking it all the way down to infants and toddlers. So there's no financial incentive that anybody is giving a family that's worth that much. There's nothing, right? So it's caused families to form and people to start giving birth. So it's noticeably juked up our school attendance rate and our birth rate, reversing a pretty steady multi-decade trend. So not why we did it, but that has been an effect, and it's kept families in the district that wouldn't otherwise be there. So that's a great thing, but it's not substantially changed the overall trend, which is we have a lot of households, that are 1- and 2-person. Everyone wants whatever our policies to be to have great neighborhoods in our city and to let people, make it possible for everybody to live in a great neighborhood. That means helping some neighborhoods come up, but it also means making other neighborhoods that have literally been closed to lower income households, make those neighborhoods available so that whatever your income, you can live in a place, where you have access to great schools, where it's safe, where you have lots of transportation choices. So some of the changes that we made, as I mentioned, especially parking, drew a lot of the fire and a lot of the discussion through our zoning rewrite. And I got to tell you, it took 4 years to do it. I mean, it was painful. But I think worth it. And one of the things we did is we got rid of our parking requirements for single-family homes or any residential development of less than 10 units. So that's a big source of, yes, thank you. That's a big source of friction, for ADUs, which is not an issue in the district. Neighbors will still raise it, but the other important thing is our development is by right, and I'll talk about what the specifics are. So ADUs were specifically called out in the comprehensive plan that we should explore ways to facilitate their development, and gave some of the reasons why. You know what they are, but what's interesting about the district is that we have a lot of examples of ADUs, especially in certain types of housing stock in the district. Row houses are very, very common in the District of Columbia. And way before we had, even row houses, there were accessory dwelling units of all kinds, right? But we have a long history of this housing type in the district of ADUs, whether they're in row houses, carriage houses or alley dwellings. In every quadrant and ward of the district, we have row houses. So those row houses have, not in every market, in the most popular neighborhoods in Georgetown, in Capitol Hill, in particular in Capitol Hill, you go down a block and every single row house has a English basement, a basement unit. And a lot of them predate, they're decades and decades old. In other neighborhoods that have a lot of row house stock where again, that housing demand hadn't been there for decades, you might go down a block and find one, or in some cases none, right? So those other places maybe have never seen an accessory dwelling unit, a granny flat or an English basement, but they are all over the city. Like I say, in every ward and quadrant there is row house. You can see on this in this photo all those little doors next to the stairs. Those are front entrances to a basement apartment, and we have it everywhere. You can see all the meters. I don't know if anyone has as ugly meters as we do, but we have huge Pepco meters. that are in the front of our historic buildings. It's dreadful. But in any event, you can tell how many are legal units because that's part of the legality. In some cases, we're converting some of this row house stock into, maybe 4 flats, right? Which is also allowed by right in most of our housing, and so most of our row house zones. And that's again to try to make the housing stock better fit the changing demographics. The first house I bought in DC had been a boarding house, in fact. And when I moved into it, I had to get the estate I bought it out of to hold the mortgage because the kitchen consisted of a sink bolted to the wall. No cabinet, no counter, no appliances, so I couldn't get a conventional mortgage. And so I lived in the dining room for 3 years and renovated it. And today it's a 2-unit dwelling. I made it temporarily a 1-unit dwelling and then eventually a 2-unit dwelling. But so that part is very, very common, as are alley dwellings. Our first population boom wasn't in 2007. It was right after the Civil War. And the housing stock, wasn't adequate to meet the demand. And so we ended up allowing the construction of a lot of alley dwellings on our very wide alleys. Some of them were 60 feet wide, some of the alleys in the district, but even 30-foot wide alleys could accommodate a small dwelling, and we have a lot of those examples. And there's some of the coolest housing, in the city. But as Eli suggested, we kind of loved it and then didn't love it, and then banned it, and then slowly brought it back again where it's now possible to build those units. So that was also part of our zoning reform, to allow alley lots. This is how many we have recorded. This is by ward. We have 8 wards in the city. The vast bulk of them are downtown and in Ward 6, which is our Capitol Hill. It's 1,000 units or so. It's not going to be a huge dent in our housing market, but it's a really interesting type of housing that most people have seen, so they're not unfamiliar with it. I will say that for alley lots and things like it, we made some of the same changes to make it easier, keeping kind of safety in mind. And we definitely said there were some places where they were not going to be permitted, even though ADUs are permitted in those R1 and R2 zones. We think that the impact of ADUs could be very large. We have approximately 100,000 lots that are in the R zone, and all of them now, except 2, allow ADUs by right. And that could be an accessory apartment. And thanks to the work that you've done here in Oregon, we realized something very significant. Our ADU ordinance was only effective September of 2016. And I think we were hoping that once we liberalized the requirements and made it possible by right to do it, that there'd be a lot of it. But as we looked around, and in our first year we did get 20 built, and another 20 are in the pipeline, or in the permitting pipeline, which isn't horrible, but it's, compared to 100,000 potential, it's not a lot. So as we began to look around, especially at Oregon's experience and Vancouver's experience, what we've noticed is that, a lot of places have these ADU ordinances, but they don't have a lot of housing. So clearly the ordinance itself isn't enough. And looking at the effort that Oregon has made and the kinds of changes that really caused production to rise after having a rule on the books for a long time was really, really helpful to us. And that's part of the reason why we asked Robert and Eli to come to our first ever gathering in DC 2 weeks ago about ADUs. And obviously the benefits were part of how we sold it in the zoning change. But I will mention a couple of other things that aren't always so clear. A lot of the places we've talked about today, desperately need to increase the housing supply, but are landlocked, right? So we're landlocked in DC. Plus, we have height limits, so we can't do some things that other places can do to increase the housing supply. But those smaller household sizes means that we have infrastructure capacity that may not be entirely used compared to the size of those houses before. We have a ton of people in the district who might have 3 generations of family wealth tied up in a residence, right? But they may not have credit. They might own the home outright, but not have credit. And the only way right now they can really get any benefit from that equity is to sell the house and leave, their neighborhood, which is dreadful. And if they sold it, they can't get into a better neighborhood with that proceeds. So, ADUs end up being a really great way to monetize that equity. Use an asset, more effectively. Allow all kinds of folks in the district to stay in their homes, so it benefits the homeowner, but it also provides what is by definition a lower cost relative to the main house dwelling that helps to diversify the incomes in that neighborhood, helping residents to age in place. And like I say, the zoning in most of our single-family neighborhoods really isn't conducive to multifamily development at significant scale. So it adds housing options in the best neighborhoods, which if you were to look at maps of DC or maps of Baltimore or maps of many, many places, you would see a persistent pattern of racial and economic segregation that goes back to those 1930 FHA maps, and it's not any different. So if we're going to crack that nut, we have to figure out some different way to approach it. ADUs are also of interest to people. They can see how you'd use them differently over time and in changing circumstances, right? Everyone can think about in their own life how for them and for you and your family, how your needs have changed, right? How you might have stretched the very limits of your affordability to get into your first house, and how you really would have loved to have some extra income to help you, make it through that time, and how when your college-age children got out of college and were looking for a job, how great it would have been for them not to come right back to their bedroom, but maybe have another place to be able to be. And then when your parents got older, how wonderful it would have been for them to be able to live close to you, maybe look after young kids. Anyway, but at different times of life have different needs, and how ADUs can help manage that flexibility. So Robert also talked about an important thing. For some people, even the idea of being a landlord, the ADU developer is inexperienced in every way. Cole mentioned this. And one of the things that's scariest to them in some cases is being a landlord, especially being a landlord where your tenant is so very proximate to you. I mean, I think that as much as we hear concerns about Airbnb and short-term rental, I think for many people, Airbnb is a gateway drug to being a landlord. And that it, if you don't like it after the first one or the second one, you can just stop. No one's going to make you keep listing your place. But conversely, after you've had, 50 different guests and no problems, but you're sick of changing the sheets every other day, and you think about, wow, is there a way that I could have a tenant where I didn't have to change the sheets at all? And then you're like, I could be a landlord. So I think it's all good. And it is important to let people put a toe in the water with these scary things. It's also important for people to form networks, to do this scary new thing together. We have a history in DC of solar cooperatives where, while there was a cost advantage and some bulk purchasing, I think the biggest benefit was the knowledge sharing. Bob Stacy holds a house party, right, and gets people together to talk about it. And it turns out Robert Liberty is a big nerd when it comes to the numbers, and he talks about the financing advantages. And Eli has some construction experience, and he talks about how if we band together, we'll be able to get some contractors. We can put out an RFP and actually compete in a hot market where an ADU would otherwise look like a small job compared to a whole house renovation. So if you do 3 or 4 of them together, you could definitely get great contractors to bid on your projects. So all of these things really help make it safe for others to be part of it. And we've even talked to our Department of Consumer and Regulatory Affairs about bulk applications for ADUs where they would maybe review a similar design. Everyone has to get their own building permits, but one design review, and kind of you, again, get to learn as a group kind of how this works. So we think that's really great because the rules are new. And it is scary, but we do allow it by right in almost all the R zones. It can be in detached, semi-detached, or attached. No minimum lot area size to add to an existing structure, but there are minimums for interior and for and maximums for that have to do with the gross floor area for detached units. It has to be owner occupied, and we limit maximum occupancy in most R zones to 3. We'll talk about the enforceability of some of these things in a minute. And what we did at our conference, again, with volunteers, just like here, we had an architecture firm basically do example test fits in every R zone. The most prominent, where we have more lots in that category of zoning, they did several examples. So one of the things it demonstrated is that, oh my gosh, almost every place could have a dwelling, could have an accessory unit, and help people understand how that would look. And I think that's really important because everyone thinks, oh, some people could do it, but probably not me. I'm sure the rules are hard and that we couldn't meet it, and I'm sure it's confusing. But to be able to see how prominent it is or prevalent it is was really, really helpful. There are hurdles, awareness, uncertainty about legality, what's the permitting process, what's the financial feasibility, what about being a landlord, what's the cost, how do you finance it, how do you find a builder, how do the owner occupancy laws work, what about the affordability. These are all topics we covered in our workshop a couple weeks ago, and featured very prominently, of course, Portland's experience, because what is better than hearing from somebody who's already been to where you're going? It was so compelling. And so that's, I think, one of the benefits of a national gathering. Wherever you are in the process, someone here in this room is either right ahead of you or right behind you, could come and testify at a council hearing, could write a letter, could talk about a personal experience, and that is very, very powerful. Sorry, this is from my session. So I mentioned population growth. This is where we're forecasting. We added already 100,000 people between 2000 and 2015, and we're expecting to head toward 800,000 very shortly. So, the need is urgent for us to do this. So we really have lots of reasons and a great starter coalition in the district to help make this happen. We think it's a great way to bring invisible new housing to neighborhoods. I say invisible because from the front you can hardly see it. And one of the things I love about it, I've worked in housing for a while, and affordable housing is so complicated, right? All these different sources, all this uncertainty. The federal government, when I was at HUD, I mean, the open secret was how inadequate our resources were. For every, 4 families that qualified for a housing benefit, our budget enabled us to help 1, right? So figuring out ways to tap sources of equity and sources of capital that aren't currently deployed to produce housing at all, that's what this does. Most of our home equity isn't being used to provide new housing for anybody. So this is fantastic. it's going to be near places with transportation choices. I'm really hoping we see out of this a lot more innovation in building type and building construction, and I'll talk about why that's important. But also that we end up helping make our households more economically resilient. You know, Portland is one of the places that's already done a lot of that, in part because of your transportation choices. When the recession really began to bite in DC in 2008, when I was planning director, I saw hundreds of cars drop off the DMV rolls. I thought people were fleeing the jurisdiction. No. They were dialing down their transportation costs because they could. 2-car households became 1-car households, 1-car households became 0-car households, ostensibly temporarily, but it helped them weather the recession. We had almost no bankruptcy or foreclosure in a region where there was a ton of it. So in the same jobs and housing market, different jurisdictions, you know, really fared very differently. And giving places choices to have that economic resilience is critically important. So that's part of what this does as well. And it'll, even without controls, we know it's going to provide a greater range of affordability. And I think there are ways that we can also deliberately target lower income households. And I know that Robert's working on that, and we've got a special task force in DC doing the same thing. Let me just finish by saying what's next. I think locally, many jurisdictions are looking to adopt this kind of ordinance, and if they already have it, to do some things to liberalize it, to make fewer restrictions. You know, that would be terrific. I will say that in the session later this afternoon, we're going to talk a little bit more about this. I'll just mention one thing. We tried to make the restrictions that we provided very familiar to people. So we talked about setbacks, side yard and rear yard setbacks, and other things. And we used the language that currently restricts how much you can expand, you know, your home, height and other things. But it turns out, you know, the things that we added weren't very restrictive. They were the language of restriction, but in fact, most places could build ADUs within those parameters. So people felt comforted by using familiar types of restrictions, but the numbers we picked were not that restrictive. That's a pro tip. So we think it'll create substantial new housing production, and nationally, we have now, I think, a budding national network, which will be huge, because a lot of us who are doing this are kind of ambitious, not just for the things that could help to solve, but we think that ADUs could tap into other funding sources. When I was at HUD, you know, I tried to promote it. Not enough places were having much construction of ADUs, but a lot of them are eligible uses for CDBG and home. And I think that if we really focused on new construction approaches, modular and panelized, that could end up being more mass produced, it's not going to hugely decrease the cost for most people, although you could do, as Robert's trying to do, a lower cost type of construction. But I think what's going to be appealing to even people who could afford something very custom is the time on site would be a lot less if most of the building was constructed elsewhere. And that actually is very appealing to a lot of homeowners. And if we're going to be really ambitious, you know, these kits or panelized or modular construction, you know, where do we need to have rapid rebuilding of housing? It's post-disaster. I mean, this hurricane season alone, you know, really brings that home. What if part of your preparedness for disasters is zoning that allows ADUs? Maybe it only even becomes effective when you have a presidential disaster declaration. Now suddenly, all the houses on high ground that were unaffected could add accessory units that would house some of the people displaced. And when those displaced people eventually got permanent housing, that you'd have more housing density in the very best places for housing to be in that region. So, you know, what if you could put these kits, modular or panelized housing, on a GSA schedule? So when there's a disaster boom, they could be delivered on, you know, by pallet, you know, to a disaster-stricken region, and again, much more rapidly constructed. So anyway, that's the kind of thing that this national convening could lead to, and I'm very excited and delighted to be here. Thank you.